Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, this is a special uh, impromptu episode of the Mattriarchy. I am Matt Reese, your typical host, and technically I'm on hiatus, but we got some sad news today, and I just had to come and talk about it. And I've invited Mark Pellegrini to come along too, to discuss the career and the impact of Alan Grant, who sadly passed away.
Well, I mean,
And
I'm happy to talk about his work. He's one of the most prolific Batman authors of my generation, though I'm sorry it's under the circumstances of him passing away. But this was a time to go over all my Batman trades and look for my favorite Batman stories by Alan Grant. And I just kept pulling trade after trade after trade off the shelves, like, oh, that was a banger. That too. Oh, that's another great one. And I was finding ones that I didn't even realize that he wrote. I'd always misattributed to like Chuck Dixon or somebody or Marv Wolfman, and then finding like,
mm,
whoa, Grant wrote that. Oh man. And yeah,
yep.
he was even better than I remembered.
Well, and so much of his stuff was in the time when there was like the Danny O'Neill's Bat Office had the really tight interlocking stories, and so there is stuff that Grant was part of that everybody remembers Dixon writing, because it may have
Yeah.
been because they were all part of the process, but individual chapters are covered by individual other people, and that's
Yeah,
for like
that was
Nightfall and Contagion and all those guys, those things.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote some stories that wound up in a way almost getting lost in those really huge Batman events of the
Hmm.
90s, like
Hmm. Hmm.
Nightfall, like you said, Prodigal, and
Oh yeah.
Contagion, and Legacy, and No Man's Land. And even before that, when I was going through some of these, because I have those sequential trades they've been putting out called The Dark Knight Detective and The Caped Crusader, and he was mostly active in the Dark Knight Detective ones with Norm Brayfogle, which collects the Detective Comics run from the 80s and the 90s. And even still, he had to do some crossovers even before then. And he contributed to some major ones that are mostly attributed to other folks like Marv Wolfman, but he still did a chapter or two in there, so he gets co-creator credit.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Hmm.
even when he's stuck under those editorial mandates for those huge events, like I was going through my Shadow of the Bat trades, and like
Oh
the
yeah.
first trade, is all these wonderful individual stories that you can read, like the Last Arkham, which is fantastic, that you can just read on their own. But then when you get to volumes 2, 3, 4, it's like you're getting part 3 of a Nightfall story and part 4 of a Prodigal story or a Night Quest story or something. It's like you're only getting fragments of his work at that point.
And one of the things that I appreciate so much about him was his ability to like bend genre restrictions, but still play in those sandboxes, right? So you have Batman stories, and they never stop his stuff. And I can't remember the names of some of them right now, but there's one where Batman specifically has to fight against. I think it's called the Topa. It's
Hmm.
a spirit of anger that's being brought about by an Indian mystic who's going about on a vengeance quest in Gotham City, and so Batman has to elicit the help of the demon Etrigan, and so it's still a detective story, but it's totally a science fiction horror. I mean, like a fantasy horror story at the same time. And and so that's one of the fascinating things is that Grant did just flawlessly was take these cross genre or poly genre stories and tell them in a way where you're still telling a horror story, but it's still a detective story at the same time.
I was really impressed because he would do comedy, he would do parody, like you said, he would do some supernatural and sci-fi ones. But when I'm looking at the ones that I pull off, just when it comes to Batman stories, I always lean towards ones that feature his rogues gallery. So that was what I was just like yanking off the shelf, was just all these story after story of him just using Batman's classic villains and even his underutilized ones. And a lot of these stories are just some of the best uses of those characters. Like he understood them. He told some of the best Scarecrow stories, which is
Oh yeah.
important because Scarecrow is one of my favorite Batman villains, but he doesn't have a lot of classic stories. There really aren't that many classic Scarecrow stories,
And he gets
but
played
Grant
wrong
wrote several
so
of them.
often,
Say
right?
what?
I mean, it's really easy to tell a bad Scarecrow story.
It is, and I mean, there's like Fear for Sale, which I think that was Mike Barr. It goes back, that was back in the '70s before Grant's time, but that's like the quintessential Scarecrow story. But I'm looking through these trades, and I got to let's see, let me find it real quick. It was during the prelude to Tim Drake becoming Robin,
Oh
when he
yes,
had
yeah.
to that was a really long arc. I mean, from A Lonely Place of Dying, where Tim Drake was introduced, to Alan Grant, who wrote the story that where he finally took up the mantle of Robin. That was like 2 years worth of storytelling of him
Mhm,
earning his
mhm.
stripes, and Alan Grant wrote a lot of that.
Yeah.
In fact, if you have the Robin Reborn, the first Robin trade, most of those stories until you get to Chuck Dixon's Robin miniseries are written by Grant,
Yep.
and they have that really difficult task of making you like Tim Drake as the new Robin, because no one at the time had accepted Jason Todd, and so that's why they killed him off so quick.
Well,
He hadn't earned
not
his
no
stripes.
one. Not
Yeah,
no one.
not
There were
no
some.
one, but he was majority unaccepted. So for Alan Grant to have the unenviable position of, okay, we'll introduce a third Robin and do it right this time, and he did, and he did an excellent job. And Tim Drake is my favorite Robin, at least in the classic era from when I was reading Batman comics, and a lot of
Mhm.
that is credited to Alan Grant.
Yep. So, but stop for just a second. RJ, thanks for showing up. I know this is
Sure.
impromptu. Just threw this thing out today, and I didn't know who was going to come, so Mark and I just started talking.
That's fine. I didn't want to interrupt the flow.
Sorry about
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
RJ.
No, that's cool. Hey, it was good to see you guys at NWA Con too, by the way.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it was there was a lot
Well,
of Grant Batman stories during that era where he worked with Breyfogle. I'm trying to remember, did he introduce Harold as the
yes.
So
aide de camp?
I looked that up. That was a three-parter called The Penguin Affair. That was one
Yep.
of the
Yep.
few like cross-series multi-parters. The book-ending chapters were written by, I want to say, Marv Wolfman. I actually had that one pulled off in my trades here. But he wrote the middle chapter, so he gets partial credit for creating Harold, who is a mostly forgotten character now. He kind of
Oh,
like
he was so
disappeared.
cool.
I always liked him. I like that Batman has kind of a support network. Like, Batman doesn't necessarily fix the Batmobile, but he has a guy like Harold who lives in the Batcave and fixes it for him. And that was Harold was always a character I liked, and I kind of felt they really did him dirty in Hush, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what happened to him, but yeah, it was Hush there. Harold's the one who gave Batman the Bat Subway.
Yeah. He what else did he do? He had they introduced Ace. They didn't call him. He didn't become the Bat Hound, but they did introduce Ace, and he was Harold's dog. And so I
Yep.
always liked that
Yep.
Ace was brought into the modern stories just as a dog that hung out in the Batcave with Harold.
Yep. And I thought that was really cool. So, before we get too far afield, I want to take a little bit of time to kind of settle the stage. We kind of jumped into this, but Alan Grant was a first writer for Detective Comics and then switched over to writing Batman. He was often paired with my favorite artist who didn't like me, which was Norm Brayfogle. Um, and and for me, Alan Grant is so responsible directly for my love of comics. The just after Tim ascended to become Robin, Commissioner Gordon has a heart attack under Alan's pen, and that moment is the moment that like locked me into loving comics. And so for all this kind of stuff, that's kind of my experience and how I first really got into Grant's writing. Let's go around and kind of talk about the first time you guys each recognized Grant's pen and how that hit you.
Well, I'm looking at my trades here, and I'm trying to think of the first one that I read, and I think it was the one I was talking about earlier, the lead up to Tim Drake becoming Robin, because I had this the first edition of the Robin Reborn trade from the 90s. It was much thinner than the one that's available now, and it was really cheap. It was like $6. It was amazing, but it was on like newsprint, and so
Yeah.
I read that trade, and it has just this amazing Scarecrow story in it, and I'm gonna find the title of that real quick in here. Um, but it's one where Tim Drake he's earning his stripes, and he spends like 2 years within the comic from a lonely place of dying all the way up to, and I have it right here, Batman number 457, with that amazing cover of Batman hanging upside down, covered in spiders, and Robin at last, like pushing open the windows in shadow and actually scaring the Scarecrow. It's such a great Norm Brayfogle cover, and the art inside is fantastic too. But it's a case of Tim Drake is, earning his stripes, and it all comes down to him taking on one of Batman's, A-listers as far as his rogues gallery goes, and proving that he's got what it takes to be Robin. And it's such a well-paced story. It's really exciting. It has that excellent payoff that's you've been waiting 2 years worth of comics for. Ends with Tim Drake in the costume saying "Meet the new Robin," and it's just a wonderful moment. And that was the first time I was like, oh man, Alan Grant, that guy's got it.
Yeah, that was for me. I didn't. That wasn't. I found that issue later on. I collected the back issues that led into that point, because I kind of went backwards from it was just that was the December issue. It was the February issue of Batman is where, and I can't remember the number on right now. The one that was my first with that one, and that was it's got Batman and Zorro on the cover, and that's just a great one. But yeah, that was the few one I went back and looked at that one. That was, it just really just took the wind out of takes the wind out of you, that whole issue. It's just so and the sincerity of Tim Drake, right? And
that he doesn't want it, he doesn't want to be Robin for most of that arc, and he has to get over his own self-doubts because he doesn't believe he's earned it, until finally in this story he does, and everything comes together. And Tim Drake is just sold so well as a character to the reader, and I think that's why he was such a well-liked Robin by most readers.
Well, and this is also in the wake of this is all happening in the wake of the death of his mother and the near death of his father under the rite of passage story. And what a moment that was, right? So that's quite the thing, quite the moment they have, and the build up to all of that. And one of the crazy things to go on here, if you guys in the chat might not know this, but like Alan Grant, who was himself a professed anarchist, created the character of Anarchy, right?
Yes.
And his original intention was to make the next Robin and show a guy like an edgy teenager grow into a role where he can be a companion but ideological opponent to Batman, so that there's conflict within the partnership. Before that plan could get hashed out, Marv Wolfman was brought on to introduce Tim Drake in Batman Year 3 and in A Lonely Place of Dying, and so from the previous summer before that Scarecrow story, I can't remember the name of the story arc. There's a 2-parter or 3-parter where there's this computer money laundering scheme, and Batman's out trying to solve it. Meanwhile, Tim Drake's doing crimes fighting over the internet as a hacker, and discovers that it's Lonnie Matchin, it's Anarchy behind the whole mix. And so the two stories collide.
I love the part where Tim Drake is trying to hack into Anarchy's computer, and the screen keeps saying "enter password," and he's like trying all these things. Said, "Wait, it couldn't be that stupid." And the password was password. You were actually being told to enter password.
So the Anarchy storyline, I think that's my favorite. It's a tough call because there's the last Arkham and there's Anarchy, and it's such a toss up for me for which one's my favorite Alan Grant storyline. But the original Anarchy storyline from I got it right here in this trade. For anybody who wants to look up those issues, those are Detective Comics 608 through 609. It was a really quick story, but I think it says something about Alan Grant as a professional, that he wanted Anarchy to grow into the next Robin, and he got overruled by Danny O'Neill's editorial team, and another writer was brought on to introduce a different Robin. But you wouldn't tell that there was any ill will from Alan Grant in the way he wrote Tim Drake. He still wrote a fantastic character. And the way he wrote Anarchy, that first storyline is just, it's so funny. Because you have this character, you don't know Anarchy's identity yet, that's the big mystery, who's, out there trying to rile up the less fortunate to turn on the proletariat, and all this cultish rigmarole and everything about he's the people's champion and to fight the power, etc., etc., rise up, eat the rich, that kind of stuff. And then at the end, when Batman finally just unmasks him, he's just an edgelord little teenage kid who's just like huddled up, like, don't hurt me. Alan Grant was a self-professed anarchist, but he wasn't, so up his own ass that he wouldn't make a joke about the people who didn't get or gave the wrong idea about his belief system, the edgelord teenagers who just do it because I think it's cool or read a few books and didn't understand it. And I think that's the sign of a true professional author.
Yeah,
definitely.
the Alan Grant stories that stood out to me, and I mean, I've got so many of these runs of Detective and Batman and stuff, but he did some oddball things. And oddball always stands out. The Judge Dredd, where it's the League of Fatties who are attacking. That was just, who's going to forget that? But two of the ones that probably don't make everybody's top cut. There's Batman: The Abduction, where it's Batman investigating Area 51 kind of gray aliens, and I'm like, you live in a world with Kryptonians and Thanagarians. Why is this such a a conspiracy theory to you? But it was very Men in Black and memory wiping and all that good stuff. But then he did another Batman story that was not a comic book. He did a prose novel when DC was releasing Justice League of America in one-shot novels. He did Batman: The Stone King, and it's Gotham City, and they find an ancient pyramid outside Gotham. I'm like, how overgrown was that section of the park? That there's an ancient pyramid out there. And it gets all mystical. Of course, the rest of the Justice League plays minor parts, but Batman was at the fore of this particular story, and it was the first of the series of books that they did. And you get to see Alan Grant's prose as opposed to just the dialogue which you normally see in a comic.
Mm-hmm.
He did a novelization of his Anarchy storyline that I've always kind of wanted to read, because I know that since the Anarchy storyline was only 2 issues, and he must have very much enhanced it and built on it. So I've always wanted to track that one down and read it.
Wouldn't it have been great if he had done the John Byrne thing? The way John Byrne is doing X-Men as if he were still doing it, and wrote a novelization of the Anarchy story that led to being Robin. It would be great to see what his progression would have been there.
Yeah, that what if if Denny O'Neil hadn't shot me down, this is what might have been.
Yeah.
I always kind of like those stories when, like, I think Claremont did a run on X-Men. I can't remember what that title was, but it was like, what if I hadn't been fired from X-Men and I was able to tell the story my way? This is what would have happened next. And that stuff's always interesting.
Especially, I mean, not to change the subject too much, but you look at Claremont. Claremont worked so far ahead that there's and he had so many threads that were folded in all the way. I mean, there's that there is stuff that was planned that just got just canned entirely.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I have to say I'm a little regretful that all of my experience with Grant stuff has been in Batman. Whether it's
mine as well. I haven't read Judge Dredd or 2000 AD, so I missed
hear
a good
really,
chunk
really
of his
good
best
things,
work.
but I've never had the chance to dig into that. But One of the things that I covered earlier is, and it was an inspiration to me just to see how he would blend those genre pieces, and it's one of those things that I love cross genre storytelling when it's done well. And one of the first things that I picked up from Grant's stuff is that uh, it's got to be both, right? If you're telling, a funny superhero story, you've got to have humor and you've got to have real superhero action, right? If you're telling
Yeah.
a cyberpunk superhero story, if you're telling a detective story that's also a cosmic story, it's got to fulfill both of those roles, or it comes in hollow. And that's one of those things that I just really really appreciated
Yeah,
in
no
his
matter
stuff.
what genre he was working in, he never forgot that first and foremost, Batman is a superhero book.
Mhm.
So even when it's not like Grant Morrison, right? I really like Dark Knight, Dark City. He wrote that, right? Yeah. I
Yeah.
really like that one. That was written around the same time. No, that was. I'm sorry, that's Milligan. My bad.
Oh, yeah,
But
yeah, yeah. That's right.
yeah, I like that story, and I liked Morrison. He wrote Gothic. I liked that one. But Morrison was one of those writers who I don't like his later run. The one that he's actually celebrated for. It always kind of felt like he forgot he was writing a superhero story, and it just there's a lot of I don't know.
Yeah, that
People,
was Batman
yeah.
R.I.P. That was weird.
Yeah, he started getting a little too. It always felt kind of like I was reading more of a Justice League story with Batman in it, and not necessarily a Batman story. It's like you said
Yeah,
about Batman Abduction. There was this rule that Denny O'Neil had where it's like the world thinks Batman is a uh, urban legend within the confines of the Batman books. But when he's in somebody else's book, like Superman or Justice League or whatever, he could be walking around the daylight and everybody can know that who he is and that Batman exists. It's kind of like they coexist in a continuity, but when they're off in their own books, they have their own rules. And so you could do those stories like Abduction, where Batman doesn't believe in aliens, even though his best friend is an alien, and it would work because it was operating under the rules of a Batman book.
yeah. There was one. I think it was Morrison Batman story, and I forget who it is, but somebody comes to Batman and says, "Hey, bad guys, like we need to take care of. They've done this," and he's like, "Okay, come with me." And they get in the Bat rocket,
Mm.
and why? Because there's a weapons cache on Pluto. I'm like, so why do you even have Arkham Asylum? You have Pluto. You can put Joker and other people
Yeah,
there.
he was trying to. And Morrison was with that run. I know we're getting off topic. He was trying to like do the retro Silver Age stuff, but he was still kind of putting in that edge lord thing. Like I remember they brought in Lord Deathman from the Bat manga, and Batman's solution to him was to stuff him in a satellite and send him into orbit, which is like, geez, that's a little harsh for Batman.
Yeah. But if your experience with Grant is the Batman stuff, did you at least get a chance to read the Batman Judge Dredd crossovers that he wrote?
I,
No,
I have not.
unfortunately.
He did
I,
two
I
of those.
didn't. I didn't have any interest in Judge Dredd, even conceptually, until I was older, and didn't have quite so much loose money.
I've wanted to read Judge Dredd. I mean, I've seen those trades all the time. I don't know if they're all still in print and how easy it is to get into Judge Dredd right now, but there's a lot of comics that I've wanted to read, and I just don't have, enough time to read them all. I've got stacks and stacks of manga and comics sitting here just waiting for me to get to, and I'm like, maybe when I'm retired, I'll read them all.
Well,
Yeah.
the nice thing about his Judge Dredd stuff and the Judge Dredd books in general was that there were no long running arcs. You'd get a Judge Dredd comic, and there might be 3 Judge Dredd stories in it, and they had a start, finish, and end because it was all satire and over the top violence.
He did some of his Batman books, the funny ones that he did. I can see how they might have been short Judge Dredd stories, maybe in his head, and he decided to just make them Batman stories. Like he did one called The Human Flea, where it's not the kind of villain that you think is a villain who's dressed in like this flea costume, and you think like, oh, so his power is that he can jump really high, right? No, he hoses people down with millions of fleas. It's like that's
Yes.
awful. Like I can't imagine a worse supervillain who would just cover you in fleas. Like, and that's just all he does. He just spends 2 issues going around hosing people down with fleas, and Batman's like, what is wrong with this guy?
It's like the Rat King, only with smaller vermin.
Right? Oh yeah, and he introduced the rat catcher.
Yeah, rat
And he did
catcher.
it
Thank you.
right after he introduced ventriloquist. And even though ventriloquist is one of his most popular creations, I always liked the rat catcher and kind of wish he would get his due someday. He's basically DC's version of the Rat King from Ninja Turtles, so I always liked that.
Yeah, well, hopefully he got a little bit of royalty from Suicide Squad, or the Suicide Squad.
Oh, I didn't see the movie. That had rat catcher in it.
It had Ratcatcher 2 in it, but there was like, the flashback to her being, how she became the Ratcatcher 2 with the original Ratcatcher.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so they had him with the gas mask and everything on, right?
I think so. I don't
I hope
recall
so.
totally.
I don't know. These movies, they never
They
never
don't stick
satisfy.
in my head.
No. There's another one that he did that was really funny, where it's in Shadow of the Bat. The Flea story was also in Shadow of the Bat, but I'm gonna see if I can find the title real quick here. The Misfits, and that was like a three-parter, I think. But he took a bunch of Batman's like bottom-tier villains, like his just worst, crappiest villains, and they form a team called the Misfits, and it's Catman, Calendar Man, Chancer, Killer Moth, and I don't
Oh, I
think
hope
Signal
it's
Man.
Okay, I was hoping for Condiment King, but
No, I think he was created by Batman the Animated Series and then imported into the comics. But it was a team of just Batman's lamest villains who all kind of think that, like, well, we couldn't beat Batman by ourselves, but if we team up, then we can stop Batman. And they don't. They just get their skulls kicked in. They're all losers. It was before Catman, got rewritten during Secret Six to be awesome, before Killer Moth got mutated into Charaxus and all that stuff. So these were, and Calendar Man got reworked into a Hannibal Lecter knockoff in Long Halloween. So this is like more like the Silver Age version of those characters, and they were just all like Morts and Lamos, and it was just a really funny storyline of. There's different levels of Batman villains. You've got your Jokers and your Two-Faces and your Scarecrows, and then just somewhere at the bottom you've got these guys, and they just keep trying. It's great.
well, I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about
picture, but I can't find it right now.
No, yeah, looking for a picture.
So
man, I love that moment. I love Tim Drake as Robin. He had been my favorite Robin for years.
Yeah, mine
And,
too.
and
I
no,
mean,
it wasn't the coming out that made him my least favorite Robin. It was the New 52 period that did it, when he was Red Robin and like not Robin at all, and I had no idea who or what he was doing anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, what was it, around War Games, I think, when they brought in Stephanie Brown, and that was when, like, he was replaced as Robin by Stephanie for a very short period, then he came back, and then they killed off his father during, I think, Infinite Crisis.
Yes.
Or Identity Crisis.
Go ahead, Matt. Go ahead. Let's get Matt all riled up with it.
yeah, it was Identity Crisis.
Identity Crisis, yeah, one of the worst. And he didn't need to be Batman's adopted son like Robin and like Dick and Jason were. Tim had his own identity, and I feel like they didn't know what to do with him, so they tried to just basically fit him into the pre-existing expectations of a Robin mold, and then they were just moving him around. And Jason came back to life, and I don't know. They just were completely lost with him. And by the time he turned into Red Robin, they were bringing in the character from Kingdom Come. I was just, and that was Dick Grayson's identity, right? In Kingdom Come.
It was.
Yeah. I mean, they're just attaching all these other characters, stapling them onto what Tim Drake was. He didn't need the identities of other characters. He was already he was proven as his own version of Robin, and they diluted him so much that that was about when I think Infinite Crisis was really when I kind of like dropped out of reading a lot of DC comics. I was just sort of burnt out by then.
And Tim was always like you said, at first he didn't want to become Robin, and then he had to sort of step into it. But after he was Robin, he really didn't want to become Batman. So he was like, I'm doing this for a while, but at some point I'm going to quit. I'm going to go back to being a real person.
Yeah, that was such an. He wanted to grow up to be like a police scientist, or his aspirations as an adult weren't to be a superhero. They were to be a doctor or a scientist or something, reasonable. And then he's just going to be Red Robin now, and like, all right, well.
Yeah, well, I thought it was myself after a hamburger joint.
Yeah, I know, right?
I thought it would have been a really good move to have Tim actually become like an attorney as an adult, right?
Yeah.
so that he's looking at the crime fighting from a regular world perspective.
Or
But
maybe
they
a police commissioner.
yeah, or the police
Yeah.
commissioner.
He got such a, I think a lot of the media, for people who weren't reading the Alan Grant run and Marv Wolfman run and Chuck Dixon run on the miniseries and everything, they didn't get Tim. And you could tell when those writers who didn't read those stories were coming in and trying to handle Tim, and the editors who weren't around for that era and didn't know what to do with them. I mean, they were probably, their idea of what Tim was probably just from watching like Batman, the DC animated universe, where their version of Tim Drake was essentially Jason Todd, just renamed Tim Drake. And so that's another instance where Tim had another Robin's personality and storyline tacked onto him, and that diluted his unique personality. And yeah, he got such a raw deal. It's unfortunate.
Matt, sometime I'm going to have to email you the writer's Bible I have. There was going to be a Batman animated series before Batman the animated series.
Yeah, we talked about that.
We did talk? Did you, okay? You've got that PDF then? Okay.
Yeah.
Mark J.M. Straczynski did a Batman treatment that was going to have Jason Todd be the Robin in it. 1988. I've got the Bible for that. Complete with Richie Rich's Robot Maid and other fun things that the 80s had in cartoons.
Yikes. I mean, I can tell that was probably being handled around the time of like the Ruby Spears Superman cartoon.
Yeah.
And they hadn't quite realized they didn't have to be so goofy all the time.
So, and I mean, a lot of that was also in the wake of how successful, because they had started production, the pre-production earlier, but it was in the wake of the Super Friends and how successful the Superman movies were still.
Yeah,
and of course the Batman movie had just come out.
Yeah, because I think people forget that Super Friends as a franchise went all the way into like the mid to late 80s. I think they really named it like the last season. They started calling it Galactic Guardians, the Superpowers team or whatever to promote the toy line, but it was still Super Friends. And so that was how they wrote DC characters pretty much all the way up until Batman the Animated Series. I think that was 91 or 92.
Yeah.
So I'm
well, I mean, and 89, Batman in 89 was a big shift in that too.
That was the game changer. That was like, okay, we can do something very different. It's one of those cases where it's like X-Men, the cartoons. The Pride of the X-Men animated series pilot that Marvel Sunbow did in '89 with the same team that did like Transformers and G.I. Joe. I like that pilot, but I'm glad it didn't get picked up because it would have had that same Transformers G.I. Joe quality to it, and it would have been nothing like the Saban X-Men cartoon that we got a few years later, which was part of that huge revolution of cartoon storytelling superhero-wise in the 90s that Batman the Animated Series started and X-Men picked up the baton on, and we got these great shows that could, had a bit more ambition, that they could stretch the rules and break the boundaries a bit more.
Well, especially since Sunbow seemed to think that Canada was apparently Northern Australia.
I keep hearing so many conflicting stories as to just why Wolverine had that Australian accent. They say it was because they wanted to reveal that Wolverine was actually from Australia because the X-Men book was set in Australia at the time. But the guy who voiced him, Patrick Penny, actually voiced Wolverine in Spider-Man's Amazing Friends in the early 80s, and he still had an Australian accent back then. So I don't know what that was all about.
Well, I've got a show coming up in a half hour, so I'm going to have to duck out on you guys. But thanks for opening the stream up, Matt. Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, of course. And if anybody happens to be in the chat has something that they'd like to share, just holler at me and I'll drop the link down there. I know one thing I wanted to go ahead and take the time to point out too about the position that Alan Grant had in the 1990s and what Batman itself is doing for 90s storytelling. A lot of people go on and all they remember from the 90s is the X Office and Image and all of the the big guns and giant pouches and all that kind of stuff. And that's funny to me because there was a lot of really serious storytelling going on in the Bat House, and that's where I was first getting into comics. Real drama, real detectiving, real action. And Grant was such a part of that And it's strange to me that there are so many people that don't remember anything like solid storytelling coming out of the 90s. And I'm just like, dude, what, have you not read what he did with Tim Drake? Have you not read what they did with when we were just with this stuff? What was going on there? It's just crazy to me.
Yeah, and it's amazing too because the Batman family of titles in the early '90s, they had so much talent on them. I mean, they had obviously Alan Grant, but they also had Marv Wolfman. They had Chuck Dixon, of course, is the most prolific of the writers. But then like Milligan would come in sometimes. Legends of the Dark Knight was just sometimes Denny O'Neil would pop in for like a produce Shaman or Venom or something, and all these fantastic authors, and they were writing quintessential Batman stories even before you get up to the mega events, which is what unfortunately most people remember about the Batman books from the 90s. They remember, Nightfall and Night Quest and Prodigal and, Contagion Legacy, all that stuff.
Yeah.
They don't so much remember all the shorter form stories that led up to it. And if you want a comic that feels like Batman the Animated Series, these short episodic detective Batman stories featuring so many of his great villains, then that's the run you should really be reading. They're collected in these trades called, I mentioned before, the Caped Crusader and the Dark Knight Detective. Just grab those, and you don't have to worry about continuity, really, other than Tim Drake's storyline from Lonely Place of Dying. You can really just grab any one of them. And that's what made those Batman comics in the late 80s and early 90s so accessible, is that you could just pick up any Batman book and start reading, and you would never feel lost, even if it was part 2 of a storyline. It was just quintessential Batman. And Grant, he went toe-to-toe with so many of these amazing writers and contributed so many characters. Like that first ventriloquist storyline is just so good, and the ventriloquist and is one of the he's an underrated, I think, Batman villain. Most people remember him from Batman the Animated Series. They did a really good job adapting him, but they were adapting him from the work by Alan Grant.
Yes.
And I honestly think there's an episode of Batman the Animated Series, I can't recall the title, but it's the one where Batman gets knocked out in Arkham Asylum, and the doctors put him in a cell and try to treat him because they think he's crazy. Mm-hmm. And while it's not an exact adaptation of the last Arkham, I think a lot of that narrative was, pruned from the last Arkham. And it's even weirder is that The Last Arkham is a sequel to Grant Morrison's graphic novel Arkham Asylum, a serious house on Serious Earth, which for the longest time I always thought was an Elseworlds because it was so weird. And then to read Shadow of the Bat, and it just opens up immediately as a sequel to the Arkham Asylum graphic novel. But to be able to work it into the more typical Batman continuity, a story that's so crazy, that took a lot of finesse and a lot of talent from Grant.
Yeah. And one of the other things I just cannot get over in going over my memory is like how many of the big name villains that had kind of had faded away from the public eye that Grant's writing, Alan Grant's writing, really brought to the forefront. Clayface became a major player because of Grant's writing. He of course created the ventriloquist. Black Mask had faded away, and then had a place as a serious character again. Penguin had been nothing but a joke, and it was I think it was in the Penguin affair that began transmuting him into a serious mob boss and position inside of Gotham.
Yeah,
so,
that's a good point. The Penguin was, before that storyline, the Penguin was a gimmick villain. He would just rob banks with his machine gun umbrellas or steal Fabergé eggs and things. And it was during Marv Wolfman and Alan Grant's storyline, The Penguin Affair, where they're like, so this guy's not going to be a threat to Batman, but what if we made him a mob boss? And then I think that really came to a head during No Man's Land, where that really solidified him as one of the main mob bosses in Gotham. That's kind of been his shtick ever since then. You almost forget that he used to be just a dumb gimmick villain. Alan Grant's partially to thank for that.
Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, Mark, I think that I've almost said everything that I have to say, to be perfectly honest. it wouldn't just be repeating myself in a lot of ways. Hey, if you're out there, if you're still watching, you need to go get yourself some Alan Grant books. I mean, that was
It's hard not to find them. I mean, you pick up just about any trade collection of the major Batman books or storylines from the late 80s, early 90s, you're going to find Alan Grant in there. And what I recommend is that when you're reading through Nightfall or Caped Crusader, Dark Knight Detective, any of those chronological collections, take a second to look at the credits and see who's actually writing and drawing the story. But in Alan Grant's case, see who's actually writing. You may have for a long time misattributed stories that Grant wrote to somebody else, or misattributed stories by someone else to Grant. And you might find out, like I did when I was going through all my trades for this stream, that Alan Grant wrote probably just as many classic Batman stories and people's favorite Batman stories as Chuck Dixon and Marv Wolfman and maybe even Denny O'Neil and Mike Barr and all of them. So definitely pay attention to the credits page.
Absolutely. So, I guess that's probably it, guys. Thanks for tuning in, for checking it out, and we'll miss the I just, it's one of those guys. I don't know that he was. I don't know. I didn't follow him after he left the Bat House, but I can't imagine that he was done telling stories. I don't know. So
no one ever is. Every writer has, at least one more story left in them before they go, and it'll always be the story we never got.
Yep.
And you'll never know if it might have been their best one. But that's just the way it is.
So, but I guess that's it for the show. I don't know when we'll be doing another one. I'm still trying to get some of my own projects and life stuff taken care of. But Mark, thanks for coming on. RJ, I know you're gone, but thanks for hanging out and spending some time remembering a guy that whose writing really is a big part of a lot of those stories, inspired the way I look at stories, especially, like I said, in that idea to blend and honor genres and to take your readers seriously. Those they're great pieces, and I was sad to hear that he had passed. So that's it. Until next time, guys, keep reading Alan Grant comics, and we'll catch you guys on the next time.
Yep, see you all later.